Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to try to unpack something that I think affects pretty much everyone. The tariffs from the Trump administration.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a document here. It's called Trump and Tariff.
Okay.
And it really dives into, like, the background, the immediate impacts, some of the potential long-term consequences.
Right.
It's a doozy. But before we even get to that, can we even talk about, like, what tariffs are? I think, a lot of people throw the term around, and I'm not even sure if I fully grasp it myself.
Yeah, sure. So tariffs are basically like a tax on imports. So when goods come in from another country.
Okay.
And what's really interesting about tariffs is that, like, way back in the day, before we had income tax as our main source of revenue for the government.
I had no idea.
Tariffs were the main thing.
Oh, wow.
Like in the 19th century, that was how the United States funded itself. Primarily through tariffs.
So how did it evolve from that, sort of like funding mechanism to this, tool that seems to be used in all sorts of ways?
Yeah. So as you know, income tax became the dominant way for the government to make money. Tariffs became less about just like generating revenue.
Right.
And more about achieving certain specific objectives.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So these days, they're used to regulate trade, protect certain industries from foreign competition, or even as like bargaining chips.
Oh, okay.
In international relations, right?
Oh, I see.
Try to get another country to do something.
So it's less about just making money for the government and more about...
Exactly. It's more strategic.
Yeah, wielding that economic power.
Yeah.
Okay, well, our source material here is saying that that kind of power can backfire.
Oh, absolutely.
All right,
so tariffs... because they raise the price of imported goods.
Right.
They can make other countries kind of mad, and they might retaliate with their own tariffs.
Okay.
On our exports, which starts, everybody knows this term, a trade war. And that can actually damage the entire global economy.
So
it can hurt everybody.
Really a risky game.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's bring in the America First strategy here. How did this drive what the Trump administration did with tariffs?
Well, Trump's main argument was that the U.S. trade deficit was harming American workers and industries.
And what does that mean? Trade deficit?
Oh, yeah.
I know I've heard this.
So basically, the U.S. was importing way more than it was exporting.
Okay.
And he saw this as like a huge problem.
Okay.
So he specifically targeted China and Mexico, claiming their trade practices were unfair. And costing American jobs.
Okay.
Especially in manufacturing sectors. Like steel and aluminum.
And so that's where NAFTA comes in. I've always heard him ranting and raving about NAFTA.
Yes.
North American Free Trade Agreement.
So NAFTA was this big trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
Okay.
And Trump really hated it. He argued that it encouraged companies to move jobs out of the U.S. To Mexico, where wages were lower.
Okay, and so he ended up renegotiating NAFTA.
Yeah, he pushed really hard for a renegotiation of NAFTA, and that led to what we now call the USMCA.
Okay, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
Yeah. It was supposed to be a better deal for American workers.
And, of course, there's the trade war with China.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
That seems to be, I don't know, still...
It's still going on, in a way.
Yeah.
So Trump really went after China, imposing billions of dollars worth of tariffs on Chinese goods.
Okay.
Accusing them of intellectual property theft.
Okay.
And unfair government subsidies.
What does that mean? Unfair government?
Oh, that's basically when a government gives money to its own companies to help them out, which can give them an unfair advantage in global trade.
So he saw that as a threat to American businesses.
Exactly.
Okay.
And of course, China didn't just sit back and take it.
What did they do?
They retaliated with their own tariffs.
Okay.
On U.S. products.
Okay.
Like agricultural goods, which really hurt American farmers.
So it was just this back and forth.
Yeah, it was tit for tat.
Okay.
They went back and forth, escalating the tariffs.
And this went on for years.
Yeah, and it took years of negotiations to finally reach what they called a Phase 1 trade deal.
Okay.
In 2020, which kind of eased the tension, but it didn't really solve the underlying problems.
So just to recap here, we're talking about Mexico, Canada, and China all impacted in different ways by these tariffs.
Right.
What about Latin America as a whole?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Latin America often gets overlooked in these global trade discussions, but the impact was significant.
Okay.
And it varied quite a bit across the region.
In what way?
Well, for some countries, like Brazil and Argentina, they actually benefited.
Oh, really?
They were able to increase their agricultural exports to China because of the tariffs on U.S. products.
Oh, so they kind of filled the void.
Exactly.
Okay.
But for other countries, it was a tougher situation.
Okay.
There was a lot of uncertainty, and it created a climate where foreign investors became hesitant to put money in the region.
Right. If you don't know what the rules of the game are,
exactly,
you don't want to play.
It makes it hard.
And I would imagine Mexico probably felt this acutely.
Oh, absolutely. They're so closely tied to the U.S. economy that any disruption in trade relations could have had serious consequences for them.
Wow. And our document here highlights Colombia as a case study. They're not as reliant on the U.S., but even they felt some effects.
Yeah, they did. It really shows you how interconnected the global economy is. Even if a country doesn't trade heavily with the U.S., it can still get caught in the crossfire.
How so?
So for Colombia, they started facing increased competition in the U.S. market for things like agricultural products and manufactured goods.
Oh, wow.
Because of those trade war dynamics.
I see.
Imagine Colombian coffee producers suddenly having to compete more fiercely with Brazilian coffee flooding the U.S. market, all because of tariffs on other products.
Oh, so it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. It's like a chain reaction.
Wow. So how did Colombia respond?
They were definitely worried about their economy. They took a two-pronged approach.
Okay.
First, they ramped up their diplomatic efforts, trying to strengthen ties with the U.S., really highlighting those existing agreements, like the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement.
Okay.
And then, recognizing that things were becoming more unpredictable globally, they started to diversify their trade partners, reaching out more to Asia and Europe so they weren't so dependent on the U.S. market.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Okay, now here's where things take a bit of a turn.
Uh-oh.
Our document raises a pretty unsettling question.
Okay.
Could these trade tensions sparked by tariffs escalate into, well, a global conflict?
That's a big question. It's certainly not something to take lightly. I mean, on the surface, it seems like a stretch, right? Connecting trade disputes to a world war.
Yeah.
But history has some unsettling parallels.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah.
Okay, like what?
Well, if you look back at World War I, one of the factors that led to all that tension was actually, those economic rivalries between the major powers.
Oh, wow.
You had Great Britain, Germany, France, Russia, all competing for colonies, resources, control of those global markets.
Oh, the economic pie wasn't big enough.
Exactly. They all wanted a bigger slice, and that fueled a lot of resentment and mistrust.
And so that economic rivalry kind of...
It was like a powder keg ready to explode. It led to nationalism, militarism, and this sense that any little dispute could escalate into something bigger.
And of course, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was kind of that.
Exactly. That was the spark. But those underlying tensions had been building for decades.
Okay, and World War II.
Well, there we see a different economic dynamic playing out. The Great Depression, which was made even worse by protectionist policies like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, dealt a devastating blow to the global economy.
And that act was meant to help, right?
It was, ironically. The idea was to protect American jobs by raising tariffs on imports.
Okay.
But it ended up backfiring spectacularly.
And how so?
It triggered retaliatory tariffs from other countries, which deepened the global economic crisis and created this kind of every man for himself mentality. Countries became more isolationist, trying to protect their own economies at the expense of others.
And that just made everything worse.
Yeah, it was a vicious cycle. Economic hardship led to social unrest, which created fertile ground for extremist ideologies.
Oh, wow.
Like fascism and Nazism to take root.
So it wasn't just about economics anymore. It had these political and social ramifications.
It became this toxic mix of economic desperation, political instability, and ideological extremism.
Wow. Well, I think that's a good stopping point for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part.
We have.
We've defined tariffs, explored the America First strategy, and even delved into the historical parallels of trade wars and their potential to escalate into something much larger.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is. And in the next part, we'll continue to unpack these complex issues, examining the potential for conflict in the modern world and the role of diplomacy and international cooperation in navigating these choppy waters. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, everyone, for part 2 of our deep dive. As we dig deeper into this whole thing with Trump's tariffs, I keep thinking about how history seems to, rhyme. You know what I mean? Especially when we're talking about all this competition between countries.
Yeah, in part 1, we were talking about those historical parallels with World War I and II.
Right.
And I think, we could probably unpack that a little bit more.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I'm really interested in that whole idea of how, economic competition played into, those conflicts. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's let's rewind back to World War I, right? You had Europe in the early 1900s, and it was basically like a powder keg of imperial ambition, industrial competition. You had all these major powers, right? You had Great Britain, Germany, France, Russia.
Right.
And they were all fighting over colonies, resources, who's going to control those global markets.
So basically, not everyone could get a piece of the pie.
Exactly. It's like everyone wanted a bigger slice. And that just bred resentment and mistrust between all these countries.
So that kind of sets the stage, right? You've got this economic rivalry, and then...
Yeah, it's like this background hum of tension, right? And then you add in nationalism, militarism, all that stuff.
Right.
And you've got a recipe for disaster. Any little dispute could blow up into something huge.
It's like the straw that broke the camel's back.
Exactly. It wasn't just one thing. It was the buildup of years of competition, mistrust, and, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Right.
That was the spark that lit the fuse. But the explosives were already there because of all this stuff.
And how about World War II? What was the economic picture there?
Well, with World War II, it was more about the fallout from the Great Depression, right? And one of the things that actually made the Depression even worse was this thing called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
Okay.
And this act, it was actually meant to help, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
The idea was to protect American jobs by raising tariffs on imports.
Oh, okay.
Like make those foreign goods more expensive so people would buy American.
So what went wrong?
Well, it totally backfired. Instead of helping, it triggered a whole wave of retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
Okay.
And that just made the global economic crisis even worse.
So trying to protect our economy, we actually hurt it.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the U.S. economy.
Right.
The whole world felt it. It created this kind of panic where everyone was just trying to protect themselves at the expense of everyone else. Countries became more isolationist, and that's never a good thing for international relations.
Right. So we see how these protectionist policies backfired in the past and really contributed to these huge global conflicts.
Yeah.
How does all this relate to, what we're seeing today with Trump's tariffs?
Right.
I mean, are we really in a situation that could, lead to another world war?
I don't want to be alarmist here. I don't think anyone's saying World War III is right around the corner.
Okay.
But we do see some of those same patterns emerging, right? Like with the whole U.S.-China rivalry. I mean, they're definitely competing for economic dominance,
Right.
Technological supremacy. Who's going to have more influence on the global stage?
And it seems like there's this growing sense of nationalism around the world and less cooperation between countries.
Right. So while I don't think tanks are going to start rolling across borders anytime soon, there's a real risk of things escalating in other ways. Think about it. Cyber warfare.
Right.
Economic sanctions.
Right.
Proxy conflicts.
Okay.
Those are all possibilities.
Yeah, and you never know what might trigger a major confrontation, one miscalculation.
Exactly.
One misunderstanding.
That's the danger of all this tension. It just raises the stakes so much. One wrong move could spiral out of control.
Okay, so how do we prevent that? I mean, I'm feeling a little anxious right now.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that conflict isn't inevitable.
Okay.
We can make choices to de-escalate tensions, to build understanding, to find ways to cooperate. We have to try, right? Humans are capable of amazing things when we work together.
I like that. So what are some reasons to be optimistic? Is there hope for a more peaceful and cooperative world?
There's always hope. Conflict is not inevitable. I truly believe that. We humans have the capacity for reason, empathy, cooperation. And I think you see it all over the world, right? People working to bridge divides, to have those difficult conversations, to promote peace.
So those individual actions really do make a difference.
They absolutely do.
What can, the average person do to contribute to all of this? It can feel a little overwhelming, like, what can I do?
Well, I think it starts with education.
Yeah.
You know, really learning about these global issues.
Okay.
And then engaging in those conversations, even with people who have different viewpoints.
Right.
Be respectful.
Yeah.
Listen, try to understand. And, support those organizations that are out there doing the hard work. There's so many amazing groups dedicated to promoting peace and understanding.
It's a good point.
And, even just being mindful of your own choices as a consumer.
Yeah.
Like support businesses that are ethical, sustainable, that kind of thing.
So it's about being informed, getting involved, and making conscious choices in our daily lives.
Exactly. It all adds up. We are all part of this global community.
Okay.
Whether we like it or not, our actions have ripple effects. It's on us to use our voices, our choices, to try to build that more just peaceful world.
Okay. Wow. I think we're all going to need a minute to process this.
Yeah.
Maybe get another cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Before we dive into part 3. But in the next part, we're going to shift gears a bit and actually look at some potential solutions and strategies for navigating this whole crazy world of global trade and those complicated international relations.
Sounds good.
Stick with us. Okay, so for this last part, I think we got to switch gears a bit. We've talked about all these problems, and now I kind of want to focus on solutions, right?
Yeah.
Like, we know Trump's tariffs were complicated. Things could escalate. History kind of rhymes. But where do we go from here?
Right. Well, awareness is key.
Right.
Right? I mean, we can't really fix something if we don't understand it.
Right.
And I think we've done a good job so far really unpacking this whole world of global trade and seeing how things can go wrong. But the question is, how do we make sure they go right?
Okay, so no more doom and gloom. What can we actually do to make sure things don't spiral out of control? Like, what are some concrete steps?
I think a big one is really strengthening those international institutions and agreements we've got.
Yeah.
Like, the World Trade Organization.
Yeah,
the WTO. They're supposed to set the rules of the game for international trade, help resolve disputes, keep things fair.
So they're kind of like the referees, making sure everyone's playing by the rules?
Exactly. But the thing is, the WTO, I mean, it was created a while ago, right? And the world has changed a lot. So I think they need a bit as an upgrade.
What do you mean? Like, how so?
Well, they need to be able to deal with all these new challenges, like e-commerce, the climate crisis, the fact that developing countries have a lot more economic power now. We got to make sure the WTO can handle all that.
So we're not talking about getting rid of the WTO.
No.
We're talking about modernizing it.
Exactly. We need to give them the tools to deal with the 21st century.
Okay. That makes sense. And, something we talked about earlier was like how there's this lack of trust between countries now.
Oh, yeah.
Can diplomacy help with that?
For sure. Diplomacy is more important now than ever.
Okay.
Right? We need those open and honest conversations between countries. That's how you resolve disputes, build trust.
Right.
Find common ground.
So it's not just about making deals, it's about actually listening to each other.
Exactly. You got to understand where the other side's coming from. We can't just keep thinking it's us versus them. We're all in this together, right?
Right. Global problems need global solutions.
Exactly. No one country can solve climate change on their own, right?
Right.
Or prevent pandemics.
Okay. So we've got stronger institutions, better communication through diplomacy.
Right.
What else can we do to create, like a more stable world?
Well, I think we got to get to the root of a lot of these conflicts.
Okay.
Which is economic inequality. We need a global trading system that's actually fair.
Right.
And benefits everyone.
That sounds great, but how do we actually do that?
Well, it's about things like fair labor standards, protecting intellectual property rights.
Okay.
But also making sure developing countries have access to markets and resources they need to grow.
Right. So they can actually compete.
Exactly. It's got to be a win-win, not just a win for the richest countries. It's not just about free trade. It's about fair trade.
So basically a system that's sustainable and helps lift people out of poverty.
Right. It sounds idealistic, I know, but I really believe we can do it. Humans have overcome some pretty incredible challenges throughout history.
Yeah, like what?
I mean, think about the end of the Cold War.
Okay.
The creation of the United Nations eradicating diseases like polio and smallpox.
Right.
Those were huge accomplishments.
Right.
But they took global cooperation.
Okay, that's a good point. Those are inspiring examples.
Yeah, when we work together and focus on common goals.
Right.
We can achieve some pretty amazing things.
Well, I'm feeling a little bit more hopeful now, actually. I think this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We started with Trump's tariffs,
right,
learned about the history of trade wars, and even explored some potential solutions for the future.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah.
Hopefully, our listeners have a better understanding now of all these complex issues.
As we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with one final thought. We've talked a lot about governments, institutions, policies, but ultimately, the future is up to all of us.
That's right.
We can just sit back and watch things happen, or we can get involved and actually try to make a difference.
Every choice we make, every action we take, it matters.
Well said. So, to all our listeners out there, stay curious, keep learning, and remember that the future is something we create together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.